Zhang Wei woke up to the kind of headache that felt like a small army of drunken carpentry tools had taken up residence inside his skull. The night before had been a blur of neon lights, questionable karaoke, and endless shots of something suspiciously resembling cheap whiskey. It didn't help that his alarm clock had malfunctioned, blaring, "Take me home, country roads," at full volume for a solid 15 minutes before he managed to wrestle it into submission. Groaning, Zhang Wei pulled himself out of bed, his legs wobbly, like he'd just stepped off a roller coaster that wasn't quite finished. He had an appointment with his manager in an hour, and the last thing he needed was to look like he was on the verge of some existential crisis. He fumbled his way to the bathroom, his reflection in the mirror an odd, somewhat cartoonish version of himself, messy hair, a red nose, and eyes that looked like they hadn't slept in a decade. The pain in his chest hit him as soon as he lifted his shirt to wash his face, a sharp twinge that made him freeze. For a moment, he thought he'd pulled something from the night before, maybe strained a muscle in some unflattering dance move. But when he looked down, there was something off. His chest wasn't just sore, it was smooth. He blinked twice, rubbed his eyes, and then looked again. The scar from his subway accident, the one that had taken a solid 3 months to heal, was gone. No mark, no sign, not even a faint discoloration. Just flawless skin where the jagged, painful wound had been. He pressed a hand to his chest, but it felt like nothing had ever happened there. "Wait, what?" Zhang Wei said aloud, as if hoping to hear a sensible explanation for what he was seeing. His reflection didn't answer, of course. It just stared back at him, still as confused as he was. Was this possible? He'd been stabbed in the subway 6 weeks ago, and though it had healed, the scar remained. He'd even made peace with it, accepted that it would be a reminder of his brush with death. And yet, here he was, totally, bizarrely, impossibly healed. He grabbed his phone, his hands shaking a little. Maybe he was still drunk. Maybe his brain was playing some cruel trick on him. But no. The scar was gone. He snapped a photo of his chest for proof, though it seemed pointless. What kind of proof would a selfie really offer for something as insane as this? He was about to call his friend, trying to make sense of the situation, when the doorbell rang. "Zhang Wei. You in there?" It was his neighbor, a woman named Li Shui, who'd been living next door for about a year and had developed the uncanny habit of popping by whenever she thought he might be up to no good. Yeah, coming," he called back, trying to sound more coherent than he felt. It was too early for this. Was she going to judge him for his pathetic state after last night? When he opened the door, Shui stood there, looking as cheerful as always. Her eyes widened as she took in his appearance, and she immediately sniffed the air. "Late-night karaoke again?" she asked, her tone somewhere between amused and exasperated. "Ugh, you have no idea," Zhang Wei muttered, rubbing his temples. But then he realized something strange. As he reached for the door frame to steady himself, his hand moved too fast. Way too fast that he caught the edge of the door just as it started to swing closed, but the speed at which his hand reacted felt wrong. It was like his fingers had blurred for a split second, a weird trick of perception that didn't match what his brain was telling him. "Whoa," Shui said, noticing his hand. Did you just teleport your fingers?" Zhang Wei stared at his hand, confused. It was definitely moving in normal time, but the sensation wasn't right. He slowly pulled his hand back, trying to shake off the oddness. Maybe he was still suffering from some leftover alcohol-induced mental fog. No, he mumbled. "I think I'm just still. I don't know. I don't feel great." "Well, you look like it," she said with a teasing grin. "But seriously, what happened to your chest? You look like you got, what, some magic face cream?" Zhang Wei's eyes widened, and he glanced down at his chest. The skin was completely flawless. He quickly pulled his shirt down, awkwardly avoiding eye contact. I don't know. It's strange," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. His thoughts were racing. His body had healed overnight. But how? What kind of strange fluke could explain this? Well, whatever it is, it's kind of impressive, Shui added. Anyway, your boss is expecting you. You're not skipping today, right? Zhang Wei blinked at her, still processing. Right. I'll be there. He walked with her down the hall, trying to pretend nothing out of the ordinary had happened, but his mind kept spinning. What the hell is going on with me? Zhang Wei spent the entire day trying to ignore the feeling that something was off about his body. He kept bumping into things. His senses were heightened. Every sound was sharper, more distinct. The color of the office walls seemed richer, and the lighting in the room burned his eyes a little. By noon, his head was spinning. He'd almost forgotten about the strange healing until the moment he went to grab a coffee. His hand reached for a mug on the shelf, but his fingers moved too quickly again. This time, he barely caught the mug, but his hand wasn't even in the right position. It had blurred, like a cartoon character's motion. The mug had hovered mid-air for a fraction of a second before his fingers finally closed around it. Okay, that's definitely not normal, he muttered under his breath. By the time he returned home, his mind was whirling with the strange events of the day. His chest was still inexplicably perfect, as if the scar had never existed. His hand had blurred when he reached for the coffee. And the worst part? He couldn't tell if he was going crazy or if something genuinely impossible was happening to him. It was late when he decided to test something. He set his phone on the kitchen counter and, with no warning, jabbed it with his finger, as if he was trying to puncture a hole in it. When he did, the phone shattered into pieces. He gasped and jumped back in shock, but that wasn't what amazed him. It was his finger. The tip had not broken. His nail hadn't even chipped. There was no blood. He stared at his finger, then at the wreckage of the phone. Oh, this is not good, he muttered. He closed his eyes, his heart racing. This couldn't be real. It just couldn't, but when he opened his eyes again, his finger had healed. His skin was whole. The doorbell rang again, a shrill sound that made him jump. His hands were shaking as he wiped his face and opened the door. Zhang Wei, you're not going crazy, are you? Shui asked, standing there with a concerned look. Because you're looking like someone who's not just hungover. Did you do something weird? Zhang Wei just looked at her, unable to answer, his mind racing in circles. Zhang Wei stared at Shui, his mouth dry, his thoughts scattered. He had no idea what was happening to him, but he couldn't deny it. Something was wrong, more wrong than just a weird hangover or the aftereffects of a long night. He'd never heard of anyone healing like this, becoming a different version of themselves every time they got injured. But here he was, standing at the threshold of his apartment, feeling like a stranger in his own skin. Zhang Wei? Shui's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. Are you okay? You look like you're about to pass out. He blinked at her, forcing a smile he didn't feel. Yeah. Sorry. Just a lot on my mind. Look, I'm not a doctor, but if you don't want to go to one, I can at least bring you some coffee. You'll feel better, maybe, she suggested, still peering at him like she was trying to figure out whether he was genuinely okay or just too stubborn to admit he was losing his mind. Sure. Coffee sounds good, he said, stepping aside to let her in, though he was starting to wonder if coffee was the thing he needed most. He was beginning to feel like his body had become a ticking time bomb, and no amount of caffeine would fix it. Shui entered and moved toward the kitchen. Zhang Wei stood frozen by the door, watching her as if everything around him was moving too fast. He couldn't shake the image of his own finger, how it had been unscathed after he destroyed the phone. It felt like the world was getting further and further out of his grasp. Maybe I should just tell someone, he thought. Tell someone who's a professional. But who would believe me? A loud crash jolted him out of his thoughts. He turned just in time to see Shui staring at the floor in shock. A glass had fallen from the counter and shattered, but she wasn't moving. She looked down at her feet, then back at him, her expression full of disbelief. What the hell? She whispered. Zhang Wei didn't need to ask. He already knew what had happened. It wasn't her fault. The glass didn't fall because of her. It fell because he had moved too fast again. Just like before. He had instinctively reached for the edge of the counter, his hand brushing the air too quickly, too violently. The result was exactly what happened to the coffee mug this morning, except this time, there was no blurring, no fraction of a second where the movement was too fast to comprehend. He felt it in his body, a tension that snapped like a bowstring. Did you break that? Shui asked, still staring at him with wide eyes. Zhang Wei swallowed hard. No. It was me. He bent down quickly to clean up the shards of glass, trying to ignore the way his fingers were already moving too fast for him to keep track of. Wait. Shui stepped forward, stopping him with a hand on his arm. I'm starting to think you really are in trouble here. That was too fast. I know, Zhang Wei muttered, pushing the pieces into a dustpan with shaking hands. I don't know what's going on with me, but I can't control it. My body, it's changing. Yeah, she said, sounding almost terrified. It's like you're superhuman or something. He stopped and looked at her, considering the possibility. Maybe that was it. Maybe that's what he had become. Not just some guy who had a weird mutation, but something else entirely. Something that wasn't fully human anymore. He could feel it, a strange energy building inside him. When he focused, he could almost feel his muscles expanding beneath his skin, his bones adjusting, shifting, becoming more than what they were designed to be. I don't know what I am, Zhang Wei admitted, his voice thick with frustration. He stood up, the dustpan still in his hand, and faced Shui. All I know is that I'm not me anymore. Shui's brow furrowed. What do you mean? He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. Last night, after the accident, I woke up and everything was healed. The scar was gone. The injury was just gone. Like I never even had it. And now every time I hurt myself, my body changes. I don't know why, and I don't know how, but it's happening. Shui was quiet for a moment, her expression shifting from concern to confusion, and then, finally, something like reluctant curiosity. Okay, hold on, she said slowly, as though processing what he'd just said. Let's say this is real. That your body is doing this. What happens next? Zhang Wei let out a long breath. He hadn't been able to answer that question for himself, let alone anyone else. But as he thought about it, he realized something. This wasn't just about powers. It wasn't about being stronger or faster or more. It was about losing something. Losing himself. I think it's just the beginning, he said, his voice quieter now. The more I heal, the more I change. My body isn't just healing, Shui. It's evolving. Evolving? She raised an eyebrow. Like, becoming something else? Exactly. I don't know what yet, but I can feel it. I'm becoming something I don't recognize anymore. He paused and glanced down at his hands. His fingers were trembling slightly, and as he looked closer, he noticed something else. The skin had begun to harden. His fingers were taking on a slightly metallic sheen, almost like metal was creeping through the surface of his skin. Okay, that's new, Shui said, her voice barely a whisper. What are you going to do about it? Zhang Wei shook his head. I don't know what I can do. I'm just trying to keep it under control. But every time I heal, it feels like a little more of me is gone. Shui gave him a sympathetic look, but she didn't say anything. She didn't know what to say. No one would. What could they possibly say to someone whose body was transforming in ways that no one could explain? I don't want to hurt anyone, Zhang Wei added, his voice strained. I don't want to lose control, but I don't know how to stop it. You won't, Shui said, almost as if reassuring herself more than him. I'm sure you'll figure it out. But even as she said it, Zhang Wei didn't feel reassured. He could already feel the next change coming. He could feel his body growing, stretching, changing. It wasn't a pleasant sensation. It was like he was becoming something else, and there was no stopping it. He couldn't stop it. The next few days passed in a blur. Zhang Wei tried his best to keep things normal, but he couldn't hide the changes. His body was evolving faster than he could keep up with. Each morning, he woke up to find something new, his skin smoother, his reflexes faster, his strength increasing with every movement. One night, he looked at himself in the mirror and realized that his face had changed. It was more angular now, more perfect. He looked younger, almost unrecognizable. He didn't know who he was anymore. Shui, as always, was there to check in on him. She'd started to treat him with a mix of caution and fascination, as though she wasn't entirely sure what kind of person he had become. But it wasn't just Shui. His friends started to notice the differences too. His co-workers couldn't stop talking about how he was acting differently. How he was, more. He'd become a curiosity. An enigma. And no one really understood what was happening to him, neither did Zhang Wei. And that was the scariest part. Zhang Wei's transformations were accelerating, and so were his fears. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw someone he didn't recognize. His reflection was becoming more alien to him. At first, it had just been small things, his fingers too quick, his skin too smooth, his reflexes too sharp. But now, the changes were deeper. More profound. His vision had become something out of a science fiction movie. The dark corners of his apartment, the shadows of city streets, everything was clearer in ways that made him dizzy. The edges of the world glowed, and his pupils no longer adjusted to light the way they once did. They adjusted, all right. But only to the dark. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt truly human. He sat in his apartment late one night, staring at the glowing city below. Shui had stopped by earlier, but he couldn't even pretend to be the person she knew. He had no idea who he was anymore. His body, once familiar, had turned into something he couldn't control. Something he didn't even recognize. Zhang Wei? The voice came from the doorway, pulling him out of his thoughts. He turned, his mind still foggy, trying to focus. It was Shui, again, her face concerned but tinged with something else now. Something more like apprehension. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice strained. It felt wrong. The words didn't sound right coming from his mouth. They didn't feel like they belonged to him anymore. "I was worried," she said softly, stepping into the room. "You didn't answer your phone. Are you okay?" He tried to give her a reassuring smile, but it felt mechanical. "I'm fine," he lied. "Just tired. Been a long day." "Long day?" She raised an eyebrow, walking closer. "You've been holed up in here for 3 days straight. You haven't even been to work. You're not yourself." She stopped in front of him, and for the first time in a long while, he saw the concern on her face. The pity, the worry. It was enough to make him feel like he was on the edge of something he couldn't understand, and maybe didn't want to. "I'm fine," he repeated, but even to him, the words felt hollow. "You're not fine, Zhang Wei," Shui said, her voice low. "You need to go to a doctor, or at least get some help. This isn't normal." He shook his head, his eyes flicking to the edge of the room. A flicker of panic rose in his chest, and his hands moved without thinking, gripping the arms of the chair as if holding on to something solid. He wasn't sure what was happening anymore, but the feeling in his chest, the sensation of being stretched too thin, was becoming unbearable. He could feel his body growing, morphing in ways that terrified him. It was like everything about him was being rewritten, edited by some invisible hand. "I can't," he muttered, the words barely escaping his throat. "I can't go back. I can't be me. Not anymore." "What do you mean?" Shui asked, her voice softening. She moved closer, kneeling in front of him, her gaze steady and searching. "I've changed," Zhang Wei said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I don't feel human anymore. My body, my soul, it's all changing. And every time it changes, I lose more of who I was." I can't. I can't stop it, Shui. I'm becoming something else. Something wrong. She didn't speak for a long moment, just watched him with wide eyes. There was a deep sadness in her gaze now, as if she had seen the change in him long before he'd noticed it himself. You don't look like yourself, she whispered. But I don't think you're wrong. Not yet. Her words cut through him, but they didn't comfort him. If anything, they made him feel more alone, more isolated than ever. The thing inside him, the thing that was mutating his body, was stripping him of the last threads of the man he used to be. He didn't even know if he wanted to hold on anymore. He wasn't sure if he was afraid of losing himself or if he was afraid of what he might become. What if he lost everything? What if there was nothing left to save? I feel like I'm disappearing, Zhang Wei said, his voice barely above a whisper. Like I'm becoming nothing. Shui didn't answer immediately. She simply sat beside him, her presence comforting in a way that felt almost foreign to him now. She had been his friend. She had known him before, when he was still human, still whole. But now, looking at her, he couldn't shake the feeling that the person she was looking at wasn't even him anymore. After a long silence, Shui finally spoke again, her voice steady but full of a kind of quiet resolution. Zhang Wei, I'm not going to pretend I understand what's happening to you. But you're still here. You're still you. No matter how much you change, you're still you. And I'm not going to let you disappear. Not without trying. For the first time in days, Zhang Wei felt a flicker of something close to hope. But it was fleeting, a brief moment before the wave of his new reality crashed over him again. The changes weren't slowing down. In fact, they were getting faster. His body felt like it was being stretched out of shape, pulled in every direction at once. His muscles burned with new, alien strength, but they didn't feel natural. His skin was harder now, like metal was blending into his flesh. His vision had already adjusted to the point where everything he looked at seemed to glow in the dark, and his hearing had become so acute that even the smallest sounds felt like they were vibrating in his bones. When he looked in the mirror that night, he saw not a man, but a creature. A thing. He wasn't sure where the person he used to be had gone, but he could feel the space he used to occupy getting smaller, vanishing with each passing second. But it wasn't just physical anymore. It was mental. His thoughts no longer felt like his own. They were disjointed, fragmented, pieces of someone who was still fighting to stay whole. He wasn't sure who was in control anymore, him or the thing that was taking over his body. The next day, when he went to the kitchen, he found that his movements were even faster, even sharper. His hands moved with such precision that he was almost afraid of them. He wasn't sure if he could trust his own body anymore. When he made a simple gesture, reaching for a glass on the counter, he watched in disbelief as his fingers blurred, moving too quickly for him to follow. The glass lifted from the counter, hanging in midair for just a split second before he caught it. His breath caught in his throat, and for the first time in days, he felt something like fear. I can't stop it, he muttered, his voice shaking as he set the glass down. I can't control it. It's too much. He looked down at his hand, his fingers trembling. Something was wrong. It was all wrong. But there was no stopping it now. No turning back. He was changing, and there was no telling what he would become when it was over. And so, with a heart full of dread and confusion, Zhang Wei sat in the stillness of his apartment, knowing deep down that this was only the beginning. The beginning of the end of who he had been. The beginning of something entirely new that he didn't know what it was, or where it would take him, but he knew one thing for sure, that he wasn't human anymore.